Thank you. So I'd like to begin by thanking the Oxford University Islamic Society for the invitation, in particular Martin getting in contact with me. I don't know how he came across my work, but he did, and hence I'm here. Apologies for the late start. We left London at 4:30, and it's now 7:30, I guess, or something around that. This is quite a long talk, and I hope you're not going to just flag. I won't. I can go on forever. But it's important that you hear the entire story, because this is a narrative that I've tried to construct, and as you'll see, it's a narrative that needs to unfold in a particular way, or at least that's the argument I'm going to try to make. So previously when we'll get to that a little bit later. I'll try to give a very brief background to the history of my particular take on this issue, which I call Islamic decoloniality. But when I was talking to Martin, when we were thinking about a title, he told me about the Islam and series. So I think you've had Islam and ecology, maybe Islam and liberation theology, something like that. And before, for me, it had always been an Islamic decoloniality. And then here was an opportunity to talk about Islam and decoloniality, and to kind of really think and pivot around the conjunction and. What does it actually mean to put Islam and decoloniality into some kind of conversation? So, Martin's already told briefly, giving you a brief kind of description of my background, the kind of research I do at the Open University. I've been thinking about issues of critical race theory, decoloniality for a long time. I stopped doing academic research around 2003, and I kind of just disappeared off the map in terms of the research assessment exercise for about 8 years, and then I resurfaced in 2011. There was a workshop that took place at the Open University, and that culminated in the first paper in that list of papers, Race the Difference That Makes a Difference, which is a kind of informational take on race, putting the two into conversation with each other. And since then, my interest in looking at issues at the intersectional, I prefer the entanglement of race, coloniality, power, technology, has just kind of grown and grown and grown. More recently, I kind of formulated the idea of a decolonial computing, which had resulted in a lot of raised eyebrows from colleagues, etc., in the department where I teach. But the rest is history. And if you're interested, the papers are available on academia.edu, and you can, pick them up from there if you're interested. Now, in our Muslim tradition, there is an idea that one does not thank the Creator unless one thanks the creation. So in this sense, I think it would be quite wrong if I didn't actually acknowledge the outstanding work of various scholars, some of whom are, if you like, philosophers, theologians, others are decolonial thinkers proper, if you like, critical race theorists, also philosophers and theorists of Islamic law. So this is by way of a small snapshot of some of the people who've inspired me historically, and who continue to inspire me in terms of how I think through the entanglement of Islam and the decolonial. In particular, I'd like to draw attention to this person here. Does anyone know who that is? That's Professor Ramon, who I think is based at the University of California in Berkeley. And very kindly I think it was around 2013, the end of 2013, he approached me via Skype, because I've been attending some of his talks when he came to London. And he said, would you be interested in delivering a course at the Euro-Arab Foundation in Granada, Spain? I said, oh, okay, but I work in a kind of computing department, so what do you want me to talk about? He said, oh, you can do whatever you like. That's always dangerous, yeah. But that danger kind of paid off, because I kind of snuck away from work for around 2 months. And for the first month, all I did was copious reading. And all I did for the second month was put together something like 303 PowerPoint slides, exploring, if you like, the entanglement of Islam and decoloniality, which culminated in a course I delivered, a 3-day seminar course in Granada, Spain, called Towards an Islamic Decoloniality. I was then very kindly given the invitation to deliver that course again in Kerala, South India, at the end of 2015, so December 2015. And also I was invited to deliver a keynote there, where I tried to further develop some of the ideas, hence further towards an Islamic decoloniality. And then more recently, this year, I was given an opportunity to participate in the Decolonize Not Diversify Festival, which took place in Birmingham. And I introduced the idea of Islamic decoloniality there. So there's at least 3 precedents to what's going to happen tonight, if you like. That's the kind of the history or the genealogy of the whole entanglement of Islamic decoloniality. But it's important to bear in mind that this is a work in progress. So I don't claim that these ideas are necessarily fixed and I'm kind of building upon them. I revise ideas, I change. The project continues to unfold. I'm trying to encourage other people, possibly people who might be here today, to maybe get involved in some capacity, whatever that might be. It might be through praxis, it might be theoretical work, it might be theological, philosophical, conceptual, political work, whatever. And if you think that there's something to this project, to advance it, because I'm not proprietary about the project. I mean, coloniality and decoloniality are things that affect everybody fundamentally. Okay, just by way of a roadmap in terms of what I'm going to try to cover this evening. Ideally, there are 6 parts to this talk. Given time constraints, I really do want to get through the first 5 because that gives a completely, well, from my perspective, a completely coherent narrative. But the most interesting thing for me is, as you can imagine, the grayed out 6th part of the talk, which is where we look at possible futures. And even if I can't get through it in the talk itself, maybe in the Q&A session, or if you're prepared to hang on a little bit longer, we could actually explore that as well. Okay, but I actually want to start now with 2 quotes from a very questionable figure. This is the German existentialist philosopher Martin Heidegger, who I had the fortune/misfortune of engaging with his thought for a protracted period during my doctoral studies at Ramon University, which culminated in my doctoral thesis in 1999. And Heidegger is like a spectre that continues to haunt my thought, in the sense that there's some very profound observations I think he's made in his thinking, despite his ties to the National Socialist or Nazi Party and his very clear anti-Semitic views, which have been, I think, brought to light probably in their most explicit form with the publication of the so-called Black Notebooks, I think earlier this year. So the first question, and the first quote, and the reason I'm drawing attention to this quote is because it draws attention to the importance of questioning. As you can see in the quote, Heidegger says, and this is from a very important essay which I think was first published in German in 1954, The Question Concerning Technology. He says, the closer we come to the danger, the more brightly do the ways into the saving power begin to shine, and the more questioning we become. For questioning is the piety of thought. And that's the phrase that interests me the most, and it's something that I've kind of kept with me since my doctoral studies. Questioning is the piety of thought. You can think of it in an Islamic idiom that this asking of questions has something to do with taqwa, this sense of kind of awareness of the sublime, the divine, the God consciousness, if you like. And at least that's the spin or the gloss I'd like to put on it. So that's the first thing I want to flag up is when one approaches the issue of Islam and decoloniality, I want to draw attention to the fact that I'm actually asking a question there, even though it's stated as in the form of a conjunction. There's actually a kind of concealed question at work there, or at least so I suggest. And this is the other quote, and this is really by way of what I think my project is really doing. And this is a quote from The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, where he says, originality consists in nothing other than decisively seeing and thinking once again, at the right moment of vision, that which is essential, that which has already been repeatedly seen and thought before. Again, in an Islamic idiom, I hope it's going to become apparent as we go through this material that really what I'm doing is what might be described as tajdeed. i.e. it's about renewal. It's making something new again, something that's become old, and as a result it's kind of ossified and to some extent been discarded, and I'm trying to recenter this thing and renew it in that process. Okay. So let's start with a good creation myth. So in the beginning, you've got a kind of great white male floating in the cosmos and brings the world into being. Now notice I didn't say brings the earth into being, I said brings the world into being, okay? So this is kind of like by way of a distinction. What is the distinction between the earth and the world? My laptop seems to have died on me. Okay, so this is a quote from Aníbal Quijano, who is, I guess, one of the seminal decolonial theorists coming out of Latin America or South America. This quote is from 2007, a paper which appeared in Cultural Studies. And Quijano says that with the conquest of the societies and the cultures which inhabit what today is called Latin America, and this took place at the end of the 15th century, the key date, which probably most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with, 1492. This began the constitution of what he calls a New World Order, culminating 500 years later in a global power covering the whole planet. Hence the distinction between what I call the world and the earth. The earth, if you like, is the material, physical entity. The world is something else, something other than that. And he goes on to say that this process implied a violent concentration of the world's resources under the control and for the benefit of a small European minority, and above all of its ruling classes. Now the important point here really is the idea that this world comes into being through an act of violence. And although colonialism, because that's what he's talking about here, although colonialism is and colonization are phenomena that have been practiced by different peoples at different times throughout, if you like, the history of the human family, there's something quite different and distinct about European colonialism as it kicks off in the last years of the 15th century. And that is that it's fundamentally predicated on a binary. And that binary can be framed in different ways. For example, the Martinican scholar Frantz Fanon famously talked in terms of a zone of being and a zone of non-being. Others have described this, such as world systems theorist Immanuel Wallerstein, as the distinction between the European core and the non-European periphery. So everything is connected together, but there is a central core, and then there are peripheralized entities in relation to that core. The late cultural theorist Stuart Hall referred to this as the relation between the West and the rest. And that's an idea that's been used by various decolonial scholars, including people like Bano Hesse and Salman Said. So the crucial point, again, I just want to draw attention to, is that although colonialism isn't a new phenomenon, there is something quite distinct, new, and arguably completely different about this particular instance of colonialism, insofar as it's predicated on a binary. It literally separates the world into two parts, one dominant relative to the other, which is subordinate. Okay. And there's an interesting comment that Nelson Maldonado Torres, who's a kind of contemporary decolonial scholar from South America, he says that the zone of subhumanity, which in that graphic is essentially the zone of non-being, so it's where non-Europe, the rest, and the periphery are situated, that this zone is the zone of endless war. This is the space where war is to be prosecuted relentlessly. In fact, war is part of the colonial model project itself. It's its essence, if you like. So if we fast forward from 1492, we've got the longue durée of the 16th century when things start to get more consolidated. You've got essentially the emergence of what will later become the triangle slave trade, connecting, if you like, the Caribbean and the Americas, the so-called New World, with Africa and in Europe, commencing, of course, with the so-called voyages of discovery by Columbus, 1492, under the auspices of the Castilian monarchy, Ferdinand and Isabella. The Portuguese are obviously in on the game as well, but it doesn't stop there, because by the time we enter the 17th century, we have the French, the Dutch, the English, which later becomes the British Empire, the Danish, and Swedish as well. By the 18th and early 19th centuries, the Germans get in on the act as well, as do the Belgians. And in terms of, if you like, an Islamic or Islamicate context, what's significant is 1798, the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt. Although an earlier manifestation of the colonial project had already taken place in another part of the Islamicate, which was, if you like, under Mughal rule in India, with the British East India Company. So there are entangled histories at work here. But the important point is that the Islamicate, if you think about this, if you think about 1798 relative to 1492, the Islamicate is actually being colonized relatively late in relation to other peoples, African peoples and the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And this is actually significant, as I'll try to show a little bit later on. And I guess the last part of this colonial expansionist project is then late 19th century with the Scramble for Africa. But it's not all doom and gloom, because colonialism starts to groan under the weight of its own internal contradictions, as well as a pushback from the colonized, subalternized wretched of the earth, if you like. And this culminates in the formal ending of colonialism in various independence movements that trace back to around the 1960s. So in that sense, colonialism as a project appears to have finished. It's passé. But the question to ask is, colonialism has ended, or has it really? And even if colonialism has formally ended, is everything that's tied to the colonial project itself also at an end? And this is where we get into the whole issue of engaging with the so-called post-colonial situation. And there are various definitions and ways to think about what post-colonialism really means. When we think about post-anything, we're to some extent talking about a temporal issue, something that comes after something. So post-colonial is that which comes after the colonial. But it also has something to do with the post-colonial actually referring back to the colonial in terms of a persistence. In other words, the colonial is a spectre that continues to haunt that time after the formal collapse of colonialism itself. So one way of encapsulating this, I think, which is quite useful, is to think about the post-colonial in terms of the ongoing legacy of colonialism in contemporary societies, in other words, in the now, in the form of social discrimination that has outlived formal colonialism and become integrated into succeeding post-colonial social orders. In other words, we've got something like a sedimented phenomenon at work here. And another way of thinking about this as well is in terms of practices and legacies of European colonialism in social orders and forms of knowledge. So the issue of knowledge becomes really significant when thinking about the post-colonial, at least for some theorists. Which brings us to the first of the issues I really want to start to tackle, which is coloniality. What do we actually mean by coloniality? Because if this talk is about Islam and decoloniality, in order to make sense of the decolonial, we really need to gain grip on what the colonial and coloniality actually refer to. So one way of thinking about this, again, going back to Quijano, this time a paper from 2007, is to think, and I think Martin's already made the point, that if we want to think about coloniality or the coloniality of power, one of the best ways of thinking about this, if you like a metaphor that's really useful for thinking about this, is in terms of a matrix. And a matrix that operates through control, or hegemony if you like, over various domains of behavior, practice, if you like, phenomenal expression in the human sphere. And Quijano identified 4 areas: authority, labor, sexuality, and subjectivity, by which he really means political administration, production and exploitation relative to an economy, personal life and issues to do with the reproduction, and finally worldview, epistemology if you want to get technical, and the interpretive perspective on reality that people happen to have. And again, each of these can be mapped into distinct ways of thinking about the world. The centrality of the nation state, capitalism as the dominant system of economy in the world, the nuclear family as the definition of what it means to have a family, and Eurocentrism as, if you like, the primal and core and dominant or hegemonic way of viewing reality. I like this quote as well from Maldonado Torres. This is the paper that was actually circulated in the event description for this talk. He's had a recent publication called Outline of 10 Theses on Coloniality and Decoloniality. He says that coloniality refers to the logic, metaphysics, the ontology, and the matrix of power created by the massive process of colonization. And then he goes on to say, and I think this is a really important statement, and I like the way he's phrased this. He says that modernity / coloniality represents a veritable catastrophe whereby the world populations started to be divided according to not merely specific practices or beliefs, but degrees of being human. Think back to that schematic I had of the world cut in half with a zone of being and a zone of non-being. That line that actually separates the two hemispheres, you can think about this as an ontological line, the line of the human, if you like. He says this catastrophe can be considered metaphysical because it transformed the meaning and relation of basic areas of thinking and being, particularly the self and the other, along with temporality and spatiality, we might say history and geography, among other key concepts in the basic infrastructure that constitutes our human world. Now, other decolonial scholars, including Ramon have elaborated and built upon that basic conception of the colonial matrix of power advanced by Quijano. And Grossvogel, for example, has come up with at least 15, if not more, binaries that he considers to be entangled hierarchies. He refers to this as a heterarchy because it's so entangled and complex. And that all of them fundamentally are about structuring relative to a binary system of classification, i.e. those in a hegemonic dominant position and those in a subaltern or subordinate position. But the crucial point here, and this is pretty much the view of all decolonial scholars, and I subscribe to this view as well, incidentally, is that the racial or ethnic hierarchy of the European, non-European binary, that this transversely, i.e. across all the other hierarchies, reconfigures, inflects, informs all the other heterarchically entangled global power relations, which essentially means that not everything doesn't reduce to race. Yeah, it's not like the equivalent of something like a Marxist reduction of infrastructure to base, i.e. the cultural to the economic, if you like. It's not trying to make a crude reduction. It's an entangled system of hierarchies. But the structural organizing principle of that entanglement is racism, one might even say the process of racialization itself. In other words, the line of the human. That's what's significant. If we move forward or back a little bit as well, and think about issues to do with space and time and, if you like, subjectivity, really what we're talking about here is entanglements of geography and history and worth or value, if you like, in terms of who gets to count as human and who doesn't, essentially. And what the schematic is trying to show is essentially what happens with the colonial modern project is that those who are situated ostensibly in the same time period, they are suddenly transported into the past as a result of where they stand in geographic relation to the dominant colonizing power. Probably what I'm trying to say is best summarized by a couple of statements by decolonial scholars such as Bernard Hesse, when he says that Modernity's universal frames of reference are founded on distancing and separation. Hence, the conquered, repressed, or estranged other is deemed to occupy the same space, but assigned to a different time. Further, spatiality and temporally, modernity cannot be understood outside of a contrast with the pre-modern and the non-West. So it's not just about time. See, other decolonial scholars have pointed to a distinction which I think is really important, that when we talk about modernity, there's a tendency to think that we're just talking about history or time. We've got the modern period, we've got now the postmodern period, some people are even talking about the post-postmodern, we've also got the classic period, and we've also got antiquity. So there's a timeline at work there, a history. But the insight and massive contribution, in my opinion, of the decolonial scholars is to say that you can't say time without saying space. You can't say modernity without saying coloniality. Okay? So if we go back to the schematic, if we look at the time axis, well, when we talk about modernity, we're talking about something that has certain attributes associated with it. It's the now, it's the current, it's the changing, it's dynamic. Whereas tradition is regarded as something fixed, something that was yesterday, something that was static, something that's passé, something that's old, something that we can romanticize about. There's something that can't really inform the now. But it's not sufficient simply to talk about modernity in terms of its temporality. We also have to think about how space and time actually relate to each other. And if you think about it, to some extent, this is almost like a Cartesian grid of some form of work here. So in terms of space, again, because we're talking about a colonial system of power relations, which eventually becomes global and systemic, that we need to think, or arguably, one of the best ways of thinking about this is to use something like Wallerstein's world systems theory and to think in terms of the core and its periphery. Yeah? And the core, as I've said earlier, is situated in the West, it's situated in Europe, and the periphery is in the non-West or non-Europe. But now let's entangle that further by thinking about who is actually positioned in those places. It's not just that they're Europeans. No, there's something else. If you're in the core, you're in modernity. And if you're in modernity, you're actually in the core. Similarly, if you're in the periphery, you're in the past, you're in the realm of tradition. And it doesn't stop there, because if you're modern and in the core, you're actually human. You're civilized. Whereas if you're in the periphery and you're stuck in the past and you're stuck in tradition, you're subhuman. That has to be the case. Why? Because of the nature of the line of the human separating the world into two hemispheres. The zone of being, the zone of where human beings live, and the zone of non-being. Well, if this is the zone of non-being, and humans are in the zone of being, then what must be in the zone of non-being? There must be either non-human or subhuman in some sense. So what we're seeing here is an entanglement of history and geography and anthropology. They're all mutually informing and inflecting each other. And again, this is an evidence of spatiality for the production of this discourse. In other words, modernity is a mask, in some sense, for coloniality. Okay? And we can think about forms of coloniality. This again is going back to the work of Aníbal Quijano. And I don't have time to get into this in depth, and I've talked about this in my other talks, and anyone who's interested in following up my particular take on this issue, you can download all my previous talks from my academia.edu page. All the previous PowerPoint slides are available. And so a lot of this that I'm going to have to kind of skim over is unpacked in greater detail. So you have to think about this as a kind of ongoing narrative. This is just the latest installment of the story that I'm trying to tell this evening. So Quijano sees various forms of coloniality, and three he kind of differentiates. Systems of hierarchy, systems of knowledge, and systems of culture. And the one I just want to focus on and draw your attention to is systems of hierarchies, because I really want to reinforce the centrality of race as a structural and systemic organizing principle in coloniality or colonial modernity. So there are different ways of thinking about race, racism, racialization, different critical race theorists and decolonial scholars and post-colonial scholars. They theorize this term or this set of terms differently. But for me, after spending maybe, I guess around a decade reading various accounts and trying to think about this for myself a little bit as well, I've come to the conclusion that race, racism, and racialization are just essentially the same thing. It comes down to the same thing, or at least they're so intrinsically entangled with each other that you may as well treat them the same. And I think all of them fundamentally involve three sub-processes, if you like, if you want to think of race, racism, racialization as a kind of big process. And the processes are really one of exclusion, one of the production of hierarchy, and the third one, and which is really important, is naturalization. Now, by naturalization, I don't necessarily mean that race somehow needs to be tied to biology, although historically there's, whether it's genetics or phenotype, exterior markers such as skin color, nose shape, hair texture, gait, whatever it is, that's clearly been the case that race, racism, racialization have been tied to these external or phenotypic markers, the biological, if you like. But that's not exclusively the case, because, for example, Immanuel Kant, a very important German philosopher, he had a conception of race that was not really centralized on the phenotypic, but rather he thought about race more in terms of kind of developmental capacity. So it was a more kind of historicist conception of race, or if you like, a kind of culturalist conception of race, that the civilized were somehow further ahead relative to the uncivilized. So a kind of almost proto-evolutionary conception, but more cultural and historical rather than biological per se. But another crucial point associated with naturalization is that it involves depoliticization, decontestation. When something is contested, it's not settled, it's up for grabs, it's something you can struggle over. But once something has essentially become naturalized, the site of contestation, it effectively vaporizes, and it's just the way things are. It comes down to ontology, being. Who is not? Who is human? Who is subhuman? Okay, that brings me now to the second of our terms, which is decoloniality. So what is decoloniality? I'm not sure any of you are familiar with these terms, and I apologize if you are familiar with this, and I'm to some extent covering familiar ground, but I think it's kind of important that we set the stage and try to build up to where I want to take us. So there are a number of ways that we can think about what decoloniality actually means. For me, one of the best sources for getting a kind of overview about what decoloniality means is an edited collection which came out in 2010, edited by the decolonial thinker Walter Mignolo. It's called Globalization and the Decolonial Option.
Time is the only master that there can be. And I know the anarchists say no gods, no masters. I think that, well, I certainly believe there are certain problems with that formulation. And the human's relation to the divine is one of being subject to the divine. And this is extremely important because it plays into questions about the nature of coloniality itself. If we're talking about a master-slave logic in operation, what might immediately come to mind for those of you who are familiar with, if you like, left thinking, are kind of dialectical relations, in particular the master-slave dialectic, as appears in the thinking of figures like Hegel and Marx in the Western philosophical tradition. But what I want to argue is that Islam is not just a way of being among other ways of being, and this was actually the third way I suggest we can think about Islam. That Islam is what, to use a term from Ibn Arabi, the famous mutasawwif, or if you like, Sufi figure from the 13th century. Islam is strange because it's like what we might call a barzakh or an ismuth or a border, boundary, barrier, or between phenomena. Because if you look into the Quran, particularly in the verse that I've quoted here, 383, there it says, do they seek a deen, and I'm suggesting deen is to do with this transactional relation with the divine, do they seek a deen other than Islam? Islam is about giving oneself over to the divine. Do they seek a deen other than Islam when everything in the heavens and the earth surrenders? So this is interesting because this seems to be suggesting that Islam is somehow positioned between being both a cosmology, it's the very fabric of reality, and at the same time it's something quite unique to human beings. So what this now creates is a situation in which the human being can either be in alignment with the cosmos, the fabric of reality, or out of alignment with it. And I'm suggesting that coloniality is the disalignment of the human being with the rest of the created order. Okay. But let me just go back to this for a second. I want to argue that Islam is not just a way of being among other ways of being. It's not just a particular existential orientation, or in Arabic you might call a shar, if you like, or a manhaj, a method, a way of comporting oneself in the world, a way of being or behaving in the world. But rather that Islam defines the relational being of beings, i.e., Islam as the nature, the whatness, the howness, and the thatness of the relation between the creator, the master, and the creation, the servant, if we want to think in those dialectical terms, thereby providing an alternative to the Hegelian, the Sartrean, and the Fanonian framings of the master-servant relation, which is defined in purely anthropocentric or human-centered terms. It doesn't matter which thinker you appeal to, whether it's Hegel, Marx, Sartre, or Fanon. All of them are operating purely within the frame or the terrain of the anthropic, the human. All of them. So just a quick word on this notion of the existential debt, because I've tried to argue that what Islam is essentially an existential power transaction. Okay, it's a relation of indebtedness. And this is a quote from Sayyid Naqib al-Attas from 1978, so this goes back some years. He says, the nature of the debt of creation and existence is so tremendously total that man, the moment he is created and given existence, is already in a state of utter loss, for he possesses really nothing himself, seeing that everything about him and in him and from him is what the Creator owns, who owns everything. Seeing that he owns absolutely nothing to repay his debt, except his own consciousness of the very fact that he himself is the very substance of the debt, so he must repay with himself or herself. So he must return himself or herself to him who owns him absolutely. He is himself the debt to be returned to the owner, and returning the debt means to give himself up in service to his Lord and Master. Okay. Which brings me now, finally, to the and. But this is the first and, because there are two ands. There's Islam and coloniality, and then there's Islam and decoloniality. And the first thing that really needs to be said when we talk about Islam and coloniality has already been said, and that is what I said earlier when I said that the Islamicate, or the Muslim world, was actually colonized relatively late. If you look on this timeline here, I flagged up 1798, the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt. And the key date, which keeps coming up time and time and time again in colonial and decolonial thinking, is the centrality of 1492, which I describe as the time of the Big Bang of race. The fall of Granada, the Columbian voyages of discovery, and it's important to note that Columbus saw himself as a crusader figure. Okay, this is sometime after the launch of the Crusade, which were actually in 1095. Pope Urban II in Clermont, France, actually initiated them in that year. But he sees himself as part of the Crusading tradition. So what I want to suggest to you is, although the Muslim world is actually colonized relatively late relative to the indigenous of the Americas and
the African continent, the engagement of the colonial project with the Muslim world goes back much earlier. It goes back to the Crusades, and that the Crusades are, if you like, the backdrop to the colonial project. In fact, a very brilliant Slovenian scholar called Tomaž Masnak has argued that the Crusades actually provides the template for colonialism. And that's quite significant, I would suggest. But the only other thing I really want to talk about on this particular schematic is I want to draw your attention to a few dates. So 1492, consider that pivotal. But then let's move forward a few decades to a famous debate that takes place in Valladolid between Bartolomé de las Casas and Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda. Las Casas being a priest, Sepúlveda a humanist scholar. And the debate was really about the status of the indigenous of the Americas. Las Casas saw them as potential Christians. They're human, but they are human. They can be Christianized. Sepúlveda saw them as animals, so they can be treated as chattel, as cattle, if you like, and we can butcher them, we can do anything we like with them, because they don't have souls. They're not human. They're people without religion, biologically. But you can't really make sense of the terms of that debate. And remember, the debate is central, and it's centering itself on the figure of the indigenous of the Americas. But the terms of the debate, if you actually go back to the recorded exchanges between Las Casas and Sepúlveda, Masnak argues that for both of them, the Turk functioned as an organizing principle in the internal economy of their reasoning, structuring their responses to the problem of the Indians in the New World. In other words, the Crusader background, the problem of the other that is the Muslim, that is the Saracen, that is the Moor, and that subsequently becomes the Turk, that is central to the discourse on this newly discovered people. Las Casas charges Sepúlveda with the desire, and this is, remember, Las Casas in this arrangement is, if you like, good cop, because it's kind of a good cop, bad cop scenario. Yeah, the priest is the good cop, the humanist is the bad cop. So Las Casas charges Sepúlveda with the desire to spread the faith with the Muhammadan method, i.e., death and terror. Now that sounds familiar. Conquest as tyrannical, Muhammadan, abusive, improper, and infernal. There's the theological resonance associated with this. So, why is that? Well, partly one of the reasons for that is that in 1453, the Turks conquer Constantinople. It becomes Istanbul. Okay, and that relatively recent victory of a Muslim people is informing the background. And that event has to be situated itself against the much longer during history of the Crusades. The Crusades is part of a sedimented European experience. In fact, Masnak argues that without the Crusades, there will be no Christendom, there will be no Europe, there will be no West. And if the West is part of the colonial project, as is Europe, then we simply cannot think colonialism and coloniality without saying the Crusades, without thinking the othered Muslim, without thinking a prolonged war. Not so much a war on terror, but a war of terror, or just the perpetuation of a war that has a very, very long sedimented history. So these are entangled movements, both forwards and backwards. In other words, the debate that takes place in 1550-51 is actually informed by what happens in 1453, which itself is informed by what happens in 1095. And that all feeds forward to 1798. So we're dealing with a real entanglement of race and religion, although, as I've said earlier, I don't believe Islam is a religion. That doesn't necessarily mean that the colonialist doesn't see Islam as a religion, or Muslims as people of religion. Now, an interesting debate that took place in a Facebook group recently, which I'm a moderator. I don't know if anyone knows about it. It's called the Decolonial Islamic Studies Facebook group, which continues to grow exponentially. Was about how to say coloniality in Arabic. or an Islamic language. And so people started with the Arabic term for colonialism, which is ista'mar. And it comes from the root amara, which means to settle. And in that particular form, ista'mar, which is the ista'afal form, is the idea of to seek to settle. So the idea of I'm going to somehow force a settlement into a space. And that kind of makes sense. It sounds reasonable. But what I want to suggest is that that interpretation or that translation does very limited work when we actually try to interrogate ontologically what coloniality is really all about. That it's not the most appropriate word for thinking this through. And I'll try to give you my alternative in the next few slides. Okay. So another interesting statement from a critical scholar of religion, Vincent Lloyd, and this is just to bring home the point that I've been trying to make, is that race and religion are thoroughly entangled, perhaps starting with a shared point of origin in modernity or in the colonial encounter. I would suggest it's earlier than that, as I've tried to show in the previous timeline. And that if this is the case, religion and race is not just another token of the type religion and. It's not just one approach to the study of religion among many. Rather, every study of religion, and I would suggest or race, would need to be a study of religion and race. You have to think the two together. And when I came across this quote, I literally had one of those eureka aha moments in terms of my own project. This is a quote from David Theo Goldberg's Racist Culture from 1993. And this really kind of gives the game away in terms of where I'm coming from, why I think ista'mar as a translation of colonialism doesn't really do work for us in terms of getting to grips with what coloniality is really all about. He says that I will speak of race creation, an act of anthropic gods, human gods, and of racial constitution. Race creation emerges out of the creations, the fabrications of real social actors in their constructed reproductions and transformations of established discursive formations and expressions. These creations are products of actual relations. It is real people, after all, who express themselves by means of a discourse or set of discourses who make meaning in history. These social self-creations come as though given, fixed from on high. Now think back to that first schematic, the zone of being, the zone of non-being. It's a vertical relationship. And there is a point of radical disjunct between the two zones. So these social self-creations come as though given, fixed from on high, seemingly natural phenomena, imposed almost unchangingly upon an innocent and so non-responsible social order. Racial constitution is what gives one racial identity, what makes one up as a racial member, what inscribes one racially in society, and in the law and identifiably gives substance to one's social being. And this is a quote from Sherman Jackson, which I think complements what Goldberg said really well. He says, I will speak of race creation. Where am I? Sorry. He says, today, at least in the Western world, it's neither graven images nor idols that pose the greatest challenge to God's monopoly on divinity. It is rather false mysterium tremendum, or mysteria tremenda in the plural. Second creators and the socio-political reality these produce. As such, it is against these and not against idols that modern men and women, we might say decolonial men and women, or colonial men and women, depending on where you're positioned, are likely to find the deepest meaning and resonance in Islam's foundational principle. There is no God except God. La ilaha illallah in Arabic. And on this understanding, the proper response to the problem of human contingency is not to seek to overcome it, but to resist and oppose false mysterium tremendum, or mysteria tremenda, and recreation, both as subjects and as objects. And so what I've tried to do in this particular graphic is really combine those two ideas together and try to suggest what I think is going on. in the colonial project in its modern form. Remember, I've suggested that modern colonialism is distinct from all other forms of colonialism that have occurred in history, in the sense that it creates a vertical separation of the world into a zone of being and a zone of non-being, a realm of humans and of subhumans. And essentially what I see this as is what I call a theomorphic projection. In other words, a particular group of humans take on the traits of the divine. They stand not in a horizontal self-other relation, but rather in a vertical subject-object relation. Or we might say a God-human relation. That takes a particular form. Those in the zone of being are human, those in the zone of non-being are subhuman. But I also really like this idea that Jackson has of the idea of a second creation, because it implies that there was a first creation, but somehow that's been, in some sense, obscured or occluded. So I would suggest we need to think in terms of a different type of dialectic of work here, that it's not one of the conventional thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but rather this is more a dialectic of truth, reality being obscured for a time, and then that obscurity falling away under the pressure of resistance. So truth is truth is truth is truth. It just persists. And if we return to the Quran, that is essentially the message of the Quran when it presents its, in quotes, chronology or history of the prophets, that they don't bring anything new. They say the same thing in different times and in different places. The truth is one. The real is one. Everything else is an obfuscation of that, an occlusion of that. And so the dialectic, if we're going to talk about it in terms of a dialectic, is one of unveiling. And that's why I kind of like Fanon's idea of black skins, white masks. This idea that, if you like, a persona has been put on, forced upon, self-adopted for one reason or another. And that what needs to really happen is unmasking, unveiling, unclothing, if you like. So this leads me now to the final part. And this is where we get into different takes on Islam and decoloniality. And there are precedents for this, and different decolonial thinkers and scholars are formulating this in different ways. I mean, this is just one way of classifying this. Salman Sayyid's work is in an area that he calls critical Muslim studies, and it really focuses, at least from my reading of his work, on decentering Eurocentrism by a kind of anti-foundationalist commitment, a commitment to a post-Orientalist view of the world, and also the embrace of the decolonial approach. So he's talking about how do we clear Eurocentrism away to make space to be able to breathe and think and dream and envisage and imagine the world differently. By contrast, Hatem Bazian, who's a Palestinian-American scholar, he talks about what I'm calling, I mean, he doesn't use this terminology, but I had to try to classify his position in some way. So I would describe it as a kind of commitment to what I call a decolonial Islam. And here he makes central use of W.E.B. Du Bois's double consciousness idea. And his discourse really centers on the importance of decolonizing the Muslim mind, that the Muslim subject today is colonized, and it thinks through a Eurocentric epistemology, and we need to peel that away so that Muslims can start to think as Muslims, authentically in some sense again. And then obviously we have other figures in related fields, not directly decolonial perhaps, in the Islamic theology of liberation, such as Farid Isak, Tariq Ramadan, Abdul Nur Prado, and Asmalam Rabet. You can also include Amina Wadud and other thinkers as well. And here's my claim. I'm claiming that the first two positions, that's critical Muslim studies and decolonial Islam, that these focus on decolonization from the position of a colonized Muslim subject and or subjectivity, framed largely in political terms, whereas those committed to the Islamic theology of liberation frame their project in terms of theological and ethical issues. And for me, there's something missing at work here, and it largely has to do with, again, how I think about what Islam is as an existential power transaction. In other words, a direct relationship with the real, the one, the divine. So this leads me really to think about the and now. As I said right at the beginning of this talk, this is an opportunity for me to question What does it mean to say Islam and decoloniality? Okay. So I would suggest that the and in Islam and decoloniality appears innocent. It appears to function as a mere linguistic device or conjunction. Yet what if this linguistic function actually masks, intentionally or otherwise, the operation of something else? The conjunction is a relation. Is power embedded in this relation? And if so, what's the direction of this power? I mean, are we talking about symmetry here, or are we talking about an asymmetric situation? So I would say that when we say Islam and decoloniality, is this actually a dialogical relationship? How does or should this dialogue proceed, given its embeddedness within colonial modernity, i.e. the modern colonial world? What qualifies or should qualify what in this dialogical relation? In other words, should Islam qualify decoloniality, or should decoloniality push back and qualify Islam, or should they qualify each other? I mean, it's up for grabs. We have to think this through. Now, this is where I have a problem with the views of some decolonial thinkers. For example, Nelson Torres. He says that decolonial, and this is in his most recent work, he says that decoloniality can be understood as first philosophy. Now, first philosophy, for those who understand, is metaphysics, so there's nothing beyond this. Okay? Decoloniality is where you start. Now, I have a problem with this, because where does that leave Islam in this? I mean, if Islam is not first philosophy, so what is it, second philosophy? Is it non-philosophy? Where does it stand in this? I like to suggest that consideration of the and points to the need to translate between two vocabularies, that associated with Islam and that associated with decoloniality, and that translation, as I mentioned earlier, always involves the exercise of power and the direction of this power relationship, of non-symmetrical, if non-symmetrical, entails qualification of one term in the relation by the other. I also want to try to make the case for an Islamic decoloniality rather than a decolonial Islam. So this is my commitment now. That is the qualification of decoloniality by Islam, insofar as I see Islam, an existential power transaction between the human and the divine, as essentially or ontologically uncolonizable. In other words, while Muslims might be colonizable and or have actually been colonized, Islam, at least in the sense described here by me, i.e. Islam as an existential power transaction, neither is colonizable nor has been colonized nor can be colonized. So this leads me to my project, and these are the last few slides. Apologies for taking so long. And I've gone through different ways of framing this. Sometimes I talk about critical Islamism. Sometimes I talk about Islamic counter-racism, because as mentioned earlier, I see race or racism as the structural or systemic organizing principle of colonial modernity. But I've kind of settled on this idea of Islamic decoloniality. When I first talked about this in Granada in 2014, I described it as follows: as a spiritual political project aimed at resisting, undermining, and eventually replacing the contemporary Eurocentric world order with a multiversal or pluriversal system informed by an Islamic perspective. And to some extent, I still hold to that. But as I mentioned earlier, and I'm not going to read this because I've already mentioned these points earlier, that my project is really about recentering the Quran, okay? Not as a text. I tried to make the case that we could think about the Quran as other than a text. It might be a language in some sense, or made from language in some sense. But then arguably so is the cosmos itself, in the sense that the Creator brings into being through what we might call a linguistic act. When you play a chord, be and it is. The Creator just has to say that. So saying, speech, becomes extremely important here. But also I'm suggesting the Quran is dynamic and regulatory. In other words, however we might want to think about decoloniality, I'm suggesting we need to somehow rein in our thinking through, if you like, thinking through an Islamic lens. And importantly, I want to suggest that we need to construct an alternative vocabulary based on the Quran for thinking through the decolonial project itself, from this relational between that I mentioned earlier, the idea of Islam as both cosmological and an existential orientation in itself. And so these are just 12 theses, which I'll just read out quickly. I want to suggest that Islam rejects supremacism of any form, and I think we can appeal to some Quranic textual evidence to substantiate that. The coloniality is a form of supremacism. Therefore, Islam rejects coloniality. Islam cannot be colonial. It is essentially decolonial. Islam is also contingently decolonial. And what I mean by that is that Islam manifests its decolonial essence as and when coloniality appears. So coloniality never appears. The decolonial aspect or essence of Islam will likewise never manifest itself. And that Islam cannot be colonized, but it can be obscured. And this is a project, I mean, what you're getting right now is literally the thinking of the last 24 hours. I mean, this is cutting-edge stuff, guys. So those who have, stayed the distance, you're getting good, well, I think it's good stuff. But this is the most recent thinking I have on the issue, the distillation into a set of theses. That I suggest we even need to rethink, if you like, the logic of the historical, the nature of history itself. That history is actually a modern colonial phenomenon. This is not to say that history arrived with coloniality, but what I mean by this is that the logic, the mechanics of history itself need to be subjected to interrogation. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but as I said, these slides will be made available. Just quickly though, I want to say that there's no, as I said this earlier, there's no thesis, antithesis, synthesis dialectic at work, in at least my understanding of the Islamic dialectic. Rather, the dialectic between truth, or the real, or the lasting, the beneficial, the permanent, and its opposite. In Arabic, the contrast is between the terms haqq and batil. This needs to be understood with reference to the phenomenon of what I call masking, or clothing, if you like, talbis in Arabic. And that we should see coloniality, as I mentioned earlier, as a form of masking, and that decoloniality should be understood as a form of unveiling. I'm going to skip all this stuff because we're kind of running out of time. I'll probably run out of time about half an hour. This is always the case. Okay, so let me just finish with this then. And this actually kind of is the last slide now. Okay. So this goes back to Sherman Jackson, and I like what he says here. This is in his book from 2005, Islam and the Black American. He says, I mean, he uses the term religion, I don't. He says that the challenge to religion is to make sure that resistance remains a means rather than an end in itself, and that it is exercised in consideration of goals that lie beyond self-serving quotidian interests. Otherwise, there's little that separates religion from secular movements and utopias. And I would suggest that's why there's a need for an Islamic decoloniality, because if you actually work your way through the decolonial literature, at least this is my reading of it, that fundamentally it's a secular project, it's an anthropic and anthropocentric project, and I don't think this is consistent with the nature of Islam itself. That's my position on this. And so there have been calls to shift or transition into what is known as the post-secular. So if the secular is really the post-Christian in the sense that, encapsulated famously by Nietzsche in the idea of the death of God, that somehow the modern colonial is a de-godded world. Well, I'm not calling for a re-godding, because the God that died was that blonde-haired, blue-eyed, pale-skinned male from Europe who's positioned on a cross like that. Even though we can read Nietzsche more broadly as a critique of metaphysics and the idea of a transcendental reality, and that is correct, but you have to understand the historical and geographical confines within which Nietzsche is actually articulating his discourse. So I'm not talking about a re-godding of the world or a re-enchantment of the world. I'm talking about rolling back on that secularization project and transitioning into our own space, an authentic, if you like,